You're listening to the Drawing the Ideal Self podcast for October 2023. Today's episode is going to look at the importance of validation of our core constructs, and it'll have a particular focus on a case that was in the British media. The case that drew my attention is that of Andrew Malkinson. So 20 years ago, he was convicted of a rape that he did not commit and went to prison for it. He was in prison for 17 years and was released on good behaviour, and it took until 20 years after his conviction for him to be exonerated. The thing I was really struck by in the interviews that I saw, apart from the horror of the situation, was that he talked about the impact on his sense of self. He was asked in an interview whether he ever felt tempted to admit to the crime falsely so that he could get out of jail sooner by doing a rehabilitation program. That would mean he could have gone into group therapy, but he said he would have to listen to the horrific stories and they would say, "Tell us what you did," and it would stick in my throat. The only thing I could do was to be true to myself and keep telling the truth. It's taken an extremely heavy toll on my person, my psyche, my psychology, my being, my soul, if you want to put it like that. It's been a heck of a devastating experience. Reading about him made me wonder about what the scientific literature says about things like this, situations where people have been wrongfully accused. And I came across a paper that I'll put in the notes, which is from 2020. It's called The Psychological Impact of Being Wrongfully Accused of Criminal Offences, a systematic literature review by Brooks and Greenberg. Their abstract says, being wrongfully accused of criminal offences can lead to serious negative consequences to those wrongly accused and their families. They conducted a systematic literature review to look at the existing literature, and they found 20 papers that were particularly useful to them. What they discovered was there were 8 main themes that were relevant to that. In particular, loss of identity, stigma, psychological and physical health, relationships with others, attitudes towards the justice system, impact on finances and employment, traumatic experiences in custody, and adjustment difficulties. And they said the psychological consequences of wrongful accusations appear to affect the lives of those accused seriously, even after exoneration or the overturning of convictions. They suggest that strategies for improving public perception of wrongful convictions should be explored, and they also suggested there should be specific mental health systems established for those people who have been. Now, this isn't a PCP paper, but it draws attention to the sense of self being central to how people respond in a good way and not a good way. They said that along with changes in personality, participants also experience various other losses related to their sense of self. For example, loss of dignity and credibility, loss of image of self as a doting parent, and the loss of hope and purpose for the future. The consequence of various personality changes and losses appear to summate as a sense of loss of the pre-accusation self. It was particularly difficult for participants to regain their previous sense of self if they received no formal apology or public statement of innocence, effectively de-labelling them. What they found was generally severe symptoms indicating an impact on health, especially mental health, and also on work and social activities were experienced by people who had not had previous psychiatric histories. So they were more directly attributable to the wrongful arrest, conviction or imprisonment. And what they saw was that people had difficulties with depression, anxiety, PTSD, sleep, and physical health symptoms, such as high blood pressure, pain, dietary problems. Some of them put on weight or lost weight unusually. They experienced nausea, moodiness and irritability, and somatic physical complaints, as well as paranoia, stress, and alcohol or drug dependency misuse. Obviously, not all of the people experienced all of these things, but this is the common list. They found that people became very isolated and had strained relationships, especially within their family. Some of them effectively lost relationships because of those convictions, because people didn't wait for them and found it very difficult to keep visiting them in prison. But also the family was suffering psychological and social impacts, which meant that it was very difficult to see people that they loved who were saying they were innocent when the world might be in agreement that they were guilty. They talked about the dehumanising impact of custody, and included within that was the intimidation of fear of violence from inmates. Malkinson was convicted of a rape. So people who do that kind of thing have worse treatment in prisons from other inmates. They said that their study identified problems during imprisonment which may be unique to those wrongfully accused. Preoccupation with proving innocence tended to be seen by the prison administration as evidence of a lack of remorse and inability to adapt to the prison environment. Maintaining one's innocence in prison seemed to lead to the administration seeing them as a higher risk for reoffending, leading them to be ineligible to cascade to lower security institutions, and curtailment of privileges such as seeing family and prison activities. What that points to me is the difficulty of institutionalisation, and we've seen that before with mental health services where people infiltrated them pretending to have symptoms and then found it very difficult to get out because everything they did was then interpreted as a symptom. And that's what was happening to these people. Their refusal to admit their guilt was seen as a symptom of a lack of remorse, where actually it was them campaigning to have their case reviewed or to be released. One of the strong recommendations that they make in this case is that it may be the case that the prison administration should not use remorse as a helpful indicator of anything, as this construct is problematic, and research is needed to explore whether remorse is actually associated with improved outcomes post-release. Prison staff should be trained to deal with current risks in relation to privileges, rather than on the potentially unhelpful construct of remorse. One of the papers they referred to said that when people had been released, they seemed to be dislocated in time, suggesting that participants were developmentally frozen as they still felt the age they had been when they went to prison, whereas the world and their families had moved on without them. One of the other authors that they looked at said that participants described feeling frozen in time while their families and friends moved on with their lives. They explained this as a culture shock on release, whereby they did not understand cultural changes that had taken place during their incarceration and felt behind in technology and knowledge. It points to the importance of construing rather than fact, and the interpretation that people make of their experiences being absolutely key to what happens, as well as the need to defend a sense of self. So what Kelly says about validation is this: when we laid down our fundamental postulate, we committed ourselves to a particular view of human motivation. A person's processes are psychologically channelized by the ways in which he anticipates events. The direction of his movement, hence his motivation, is towards better understanding of what will happen. The person moves out towards making more and more of the world predictable. A person commits himself to anticipating a particular event. If it takes place, his anticipation is validated. If it fails to take place, his anticipation is invalidated. Validation represents the compatibility, subjectively construed, between one's prediction and the outcome he observes. Invalidation represents the incompatibility, subjectively construed, between one's prediction and the outcome he observes. And Kelly goes on to say, the notion of validation is quite different from the notion of reinforcement, as the latter term is commonly used. Reinforcement carries the implication of meeting the person's needs, of satisfying him in some way, or of gratification. Validation refers solely to the verification of a prediction, even though what was predicted was something unpleasant. For example, person may anticipate that he will fall down the stairs and break his leg. If his prediction turns out to be true, or at least if it seems to him that he has fallen down the stairs and broken his leg, he experiences validation, no matter how unhappy he may be about the turn of affairs. But breaking one's leg is ordinarily not what one would call reinforcement, except possibly in certain disturbed patients. So the key to whether our constructs are validated or not is linked with our actions. So Kelly doesn't separate construing and behaviour. It is one thing. In order to act as if, we have to be able to construe as if. If we deliberately want to invalidate someone's construing, we first of all have to understand what their construing is, so that we can act in a way that doesn't fit with what they expect. So we have to predict their construing, and we have to be able to think of what might be the alternatives. If you think of somebody in this situation like Malkinson, he was sent to prison unexpectedly, as far as he was concerned, because he hadn't done anything. He just happened to be at a place where people made assumptions about him and construed him in a particular way. It was actually the DNA evidence that meant that the conviction was overturned. And so it's a good job we actually do have that, because it gets away from the prejudices of the system. So he was going about his own business and was suddenly arrested and found himself questioned, but also charged and eventually convicted of an offence that he did not do. And I was thinking about how that might affect your sense of self. So if you view yourself as a good enough person, you're not somebody who would ever rape somebody, then being accused of rape and convicted of rape must be absolutely devastating for your sense of self. The risk of accepting that was way too high for Malkinson, which is why he did not get released earlier. He could have agreed that he had committed the offence, and he would have been released long before he actually was, but he would have had to go into a group therapy programme. What he couldn't do was be there with the people who had committed those crimes and be seen by people as like them either. So it's up there with our core constructs. Despite the fact that that's probably the case for him as well, he put something else before that, and that was his whole sense of self, because so many things about him would have been threatened if he had admitted to the crime he did not commit. So although he would have been released earlier, he would have been seen as a different person from the one he was, and he would have to have seen himself in a different way as well. He would also have had to talk about a crime that he didn't do, and therefore wouldn't have had information to discuss it. That would have been pretty difficult. So Malkinson did not admit to it. He was steadfast in refusing to admit it and in trying to get his case reheard. So how can we think about that in PCP terms? Well, that's about his sense of himself as a person. Presumably he must have constructs about the kind of person that he is, as someone who can be determined, somebody who can refuse to take on board things that are not true, even in the face of great pressure to admit. And there are many people who will admit to things they haven't done because it might be easier, and for him he would have been out of prison sooner. So the dilemma he faced was admit to something he didn't do and get released, or don't admit and serve the sentence, but retain a sense of self that's intact and more in keeping with his pre-sentencing self. No wonder then that he said it had an extremely heavy toll on his person. Every day in prison, he would have needed to be able to carry on and live a life as well as he could, and to engage with people enough not to put himself at risk. So you'd have to have your wits about you in order to survive at all. So what Kelly would have been thinking about was what would be invalidated or validated by his particular stance. So by refusing to show remorse, in inverted commas, he was seen by other people as not caring about his victim, I guess. Whereas actually, by refusing to show remorse, what he was doing was saying, I haven't got anything to be remorseful for because I didn't do this thing. So his sense of himself as a person was validated by keeping that position and repeatedly stating that he was not guilty. The interpretation of other people may well have been that this is somebody who has no insight, who is far removed from his crime and doesn't feel anything about it. But if you didn't commit the crime, why would you show those things? Well, you might, because you might be responding to a different construct. Let's say he was a father of 6 children. He may decide better to admit it and get home to his family sooner and see his children grow up. He might admit to something he hasn't done and be able to still retain a sense of self. However, when that person is released, he may find that the world is very prejudiced against him because he has admitted the crime that he didn't actually do. So by the act of admission, he has then accepted the responsibility of being a criminal in the long run. So even though he may never commit a crime, he would have had to say, okay, I will behave as if I'm a criminal and respond to the services as if I'm a criminal. So probation, being out on licence, his movements being observed, not being able to work in certain places, in certain ways. So his freedoms would definitely have been curtailed. And actually, Malkinson found that as well. He was released early on good behaviour, but then had to live as a person who was a convicted sex offender. So he couldn't travel because countries wouldn't give him a visa to go and visit. So even though he hadn't done anything wrong, just the experience of being released on good behaviour meant that he had the experience of being outside and living as if he had committed those crimes. I think it's interesting to think about the situations where similar things might happen. We all know people who don't admit to something they've done wrong, but we also know people who might be vulnerable to admitting to something that they didn't actually do, or they didn't do in the way that people thought they did. So I see that a lot with children and young people, that people read into their behaviour all kinds of motivations without checking it out with the young person. And they see their behaviour as doing something completely different from their intentions. But it's the constructions of people with the power that, unfortunately, will win out in a situation. And that's what Malkinson found. He was relatively powerless and the system was very powerful. And therefore, he was convicted, even though he protested. For those of you who work with either young people in schools or people within the criminal justice system, now this is particularly important. So society may treat people as if they have intentions that they don't have, or they have done things that they didn't mean to do, but were an accidental consequence of something that happened. I see this quite often with young people, that their intentions are not to cause the mayhem that sometimes happens, and they don't really have the ability to think that far ahead or to think of the possibilities and to do something deliberately that's going to cause difficulty for others. However, it keeps happening for some kids, that they keep on getting into trouble for doing things that other people see as, for instance, manipulative or deliberate. If you think of Malkinson's response from a PCP point of view, his sense of self was invalidated by his conviction. He was not the sort of person who did that kind of things as far as he construed himself. Fortunately for him, neither did his close people think that he was that kind of person. That could have been different from a different background or different family situation, or somebody with fewer friends or something like that. But he found that he had the strength to keep hold of his construing, the way he saw himself before he was incarcerated, and hang on to that sense of self in a strong enough way that he could come out of the other side 20 years later and still be true to himself. So although what happened to him was horrendous, his sense of himself was validated by the way he responded to those experiences. Now, this is why it's important to think about reinforcement, because actually, if it was as simple as being reinforcement, he would probably have taken another route. He might have gone to the sex offenders group and played enough part in order to get out, because getting out was the thing that mattered more than anything. That didn't happen to him. So he refused to go to the group and therefore was seen differently by other people, but still was true to himself. It would have been more invalidating for him to go along to the group and talk about things that he hadn't done, but also to be with people as a group, and part of a social group is identifying with each other, that commonality, so having some shared experiences, sharing each other's constructions, which is what group work is all about, that he would have had to identify himself as part of that group. That would have caused a loss of a sense of self to him. So he didn't do it and therefore had to serve a longer sentence. So it might be worth thinking about this from your own point of view. What are the constructs that you would see yourself as defending to the absolute nth degree? Are there things about you that you could not accept change without losing who you are? That personhood that you've developed and your personality and the way you interact with the world, your sense of who you are. And what Kelly would say is your sense of who you are relates to how you behave. It's not separate from that. So we behave in accordance with our construing. So it's not a two-step process. It's one thing that happens all the time. So think about what you would stand up for. So which of your constructs will be so important to you that you would defend them? And I think one of the reasons I'm really interested in this is I had thought that freedom mattered more than anything to me. And this case has made me wonder about that. So in that situation where you don't have freedom, he could have had it had he admitted to something he didn't do. Would I do that in order to get freedom? I don't know. Hopefully, I'm never going to have to find out. But there are other constructs which are much more important that come into play. Role is an important one here as well. So if you are, as he was, the child of somebody and his mum supported him all the way through, what would it do to your mum if you went down that line and then when you came out of prison you lived as somebody who had committed an awful crime like that? Could you do that within that role? Now, that might be the same if you have children. Do you want your children to think of you in that kind of way? Even if you can explain to them it wasn't true, you only said it so you could get out to see them, society would treat you as if you had been rightfully convicted. So role is important because the way we respond in our roles will be according to our core construing, but also according to our construing of the others' construing. So being able to construe the impact on his mum would have meant that he had to be able to construe his mum's construing. Sociality, being able to play a role with somebody when you can construe their construing. So have a think about what would turn around a situation and mean that you would definitely never give in. Or what would be the things you'd flex on that you could tolerate? Okay, I can shift on this construct because one of those others is much more important to me. I suppose what I've done is put something in there just for us to muse over, really, so that we can think about how important validation is and how it's not reinforcement. Reinforcement doesn't work in the way that validation does to explain why somebody might respond in a particular way to an experience. So bear that in mind when you're working with people, that in order to understand them, you need to understand what's making them tick, i.e., what their core constructs are and how they're connected together and whether some are more important than others, which goes back to the importance of finding out. If you remember at the end of last month, I said we have a new book out from the Coventry Constructivist Centre, which is about different techniques you can use. If you take a look at that book, very cheap. It is designed as an ebook, and interestingly, we've sold more paperbacks than ebooks, which surprised me. But what you can do with that is use it to find out what sort of techniques will suit what you want to be able to do with somebody. Right, I'll see you again at the end of November. Bye.